Good morning, and welcome to Supporting Your Child with Dyslexia. We are excited to have today Miss Gina North here with us today. Gina North has been an education specialist for dyslexia for Fairfax County Public Schools since January of 2024. Prior to that, she was in the Office of Special Education Instruction as a special education teacher for over 10 years. She completed the academic language therapy training through the Atlantic Seaboard Dyslexia Education Center and provided private services for 5 years prior to taking her current position. Gina has a master's degree in special education from George Mason University and a master's in rehabilitation counseling from the Medical College of Virginia. She has a long personal history with Fairfax County Public School as a student, child of an employee, parent, and teacher. We're so happy to have you, Gina, so now we'll turn it to you.
Great. Thank you, Nadia. And thank you all for coming. We tried something a little different this year for Dyslexia Awareness Month in the hopes that we could reach a wider audience. So I'm thrilled to see the number of people who have registered and who are attending this morning. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Our outcomes for today, you are going to leave today knowing the definition of dyslexia and some of the markers. You'll understand what reading instruction should look like for students with dyslexia, learn some of the myths and facts, and then hopefully you'll leave here today with some resources and supports that you can use at home. So before we get too far in, I would just like to, I don't know if you have the hand raise tool or if there's any of those that are active in a webinar, or just think to yourself, but I'm guessing most of us can raise our hands to most of these. Oh, good, it does work. Thank you, Susan. So as you see these bullets pop on the screen, just raise your hand if it applies to you. So who has a child who is kind? Yes. How about a child who loves to draw? How about a child who loves Legos? Which was in my house. Stepping on those things was never fun. Okay, how about a child who plays a musical instrument? Okay. How about plays a sport? Lots of hands, lots of thumbs up. How about a child who can cook or bake? Lots of those too. How about a child who's a great sibling or a great friend to others? Okay. How about who has a child who struggles to read? Okay. And I do this just as a reminder that our students with dyslexia have a lot of strengths, and that last bullet, struggling to read, does not in any way, shape, or form define who they are. So it's just a reminder of their strengths and that those that we should celebrate every day. So let's start with, what is dyslexia? So this is the definition of dyslexia. It comes from the International Dyslexia Association. It is from 2002. I will say that the IDA is currently in the process of updating this definition to make it a little more broad. But this is the current definition that is widely accepted throughout the education industry. So dyslexia is a specific learning disability that is neurobiological in origin. It is characterized by difficulties with accurate and/or fluent word recognition and by poor spelling and decoding abilities. These difficulties typically result from a deficit in the phonological component of language, and it is often unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities and the provision of effective classroom instruction. Secondary consequences may include problems in reading comprehension and reduced reading experience, and that can impede growth of vocabulary and background knowledge. So that is the accepted definition. Again, it is being updated, Public comment just closed on September 2nd, so I'm not sure exactly when the updated version will come out, but it will come out soon and be slightly expanded. But this is the basis for what we're going to talk about today. So continuing on, dyslexia is, like all learning disabilities, it's a spectrum disorder. So that means it's going to vary in the level of impact. So someone could have mild dyslexia, someone could have severe dyslexia, and someone could be in the middle. It's going to impact everyone in different ways and in different levels. Having dyslexia does not mean that a child automatically requires special education services. It does mean that they require a certain type of instruction. The most commonly observed impairment is a difficulty in phonological processing, and this could be phonological awareness, processing speed, or phonological memory. And phonological processing is really about sound. Can I understand that words are made up of different sounds? Can I hear those different sounds? Can I associate those sounds with letters? That's where the phonological processing really impacts. Now, working memory and general processing speed can also contribute to the impact that dyslexia will have. And dyslexia does frequently co-occur with one or more other developmental difficulties, which could be developmental language disorder, dyscalculia, or even ADHD. But one thing to note, it is not uncommon at all for some students to have a harder time, excuse me, picking up reading skills than their peers, even when a learning disability is not present. So sometimes students are just slower to acquire those reading skills, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they have a learning disability or dyslexia. And I use my own child as an example. In first grade, ended first grade, definitely not at the same level as his peers. Received intervention in second grade, and that was really all he needed, was just a short intervention, some direct instruction, and his reading took off. And he is now loves reading so much, he's actually pursuing a master's degree in library information and science. But sometimes they just need some instruction and they will catch up with their peers. Thank you. I'm, yes, quite proud. So this graphic is called the simple view of reading. And what this is depicting is that in order for us to attain reading comprehension, we must be able to recognize the words on the page or decode them, but we also have to have language comprehension, and putting the two together gives us reading comprehension. So I have to have all of this language knowledge. I have to be able to read the words on the page, and when I put them together, then I will understand what I read. Dyslexia is in that word recognition part of this equation. So in other words, if I can't decode any of the words on the page, that word recognition is 0, but I have fabulous language comprehension, which is most of our kids with dyslexia. 0 times 1 is 0, right? My reading comprehension, I'm not going to comprehend. The reverse is also true. Excuse me. Goodness. Sometimes we have students who can recognize all the words on the page, but don't have that language comprehension piece. So again, 1 times 0 is 0. I'm not going to have that reading comprehension. If I'm an okay decoder, I can kind of make my way through or muddle my way through. I might read half the words correctly. I'm still only going to understand half of what I read. But this area over here, this word recognition, that's really where dyslexia lives. So this is just another graphic. So again, dyslexia is when I have poor word recognition, or sometimes I could have good word recognition, but I am doing it so slowly that I don't have enough brain capacity to also understand what I'm reading. I'm spending all of my energy decoding those words. But I typically have good language processing. A general reading disability, I struggle with both the word recognition and the language comprehension process. Again, hyperlexia, which we don't see quite as often. I have really good word recognition, but I'm lacking that language comprehension. So I'm reading the words really well, but I don't understand what they mean, so I can't get to that reading comprehension. And then typical reading ability, I have good language comprehension processes, and I also have good word recognition. So let's talk about some of those characteristics of dyslexia. So there's a lot of fabulous research out there about dyslexia, and some of the research that I personally find most fascinating are these functional MRI studies that they do. So they have taken MRIs of people while reading, and you can see in this graphic, a typical reader, all of these areas in their left hemisphere are activated when they read. Someone with dyslexia, there are parts of their left hemisphere that are not engaged in that reading process, and that's why they struggle. So some of the characteristics, when they're really young, they may have delayed or problematic speech. Their expressive language, so their output orally, may be poor. They may have difficulty learning nursery rhymes. They'll have difficulty associating letters and sounds. Again, that's that what we call phonological piece. They don't understand that words are made up of sounds that come apart. Like they'll know the word cat, but they don't understand that there's three separate sounds that, when put together, make that word. They may make reading areas that are not connected to the sounds of the letters on the page. And this you especially see in the younger children because they have pictures in their books. So I may see a picture of a bunny and the word may say rabbit. And I don't even look at the letters. I just know, and I'm going to substitute the word bunny for rabbit. And they may have a lot of difficulty sounding out simple words, again, because they don't haven't totally mapped that concept that that word cat is made up of three separate sounds. As students get older, they may complain about how hard reading is, or they may read and it's just very slow, labored, poor fluency. And fluency is like reading as I'm speaking or as I talk, and prosody. And prosody is when I put expression into my reading. But if you think about the fact that it's like really hard for me to read those words on that page, I don't have the mental capacity to associate meaning with what I'm reading, nor do I have the mental capacity to put any voice to it. They may have difficulty reading isolated individual words presented in a list, but do better when they're reading a text. And that's because they have all those other words around the text to sort of compensate for words they don't know. They may substitute hard to pronounce words with easier ones. So, example, they'll say car instead of automobile because car is much easier to say. And you'll also see that often in writing, which is that next bullet. So they'll have writing that doesn't match their oral language abilities. I can't tell you how many students I had that, would write very little. And when I asked them to tell me about their writing, go on with this fabulous story, but none of that's on the page because they are able to produce this oral language, have this high vocabulary, but putting it on paper is really hard. And again, that's where they'll substitute simple words like car for automobile. Their sentences will be a lot shorter than what they would normally produce orally. They may have a lot of difficulty learning a foreign language. You will see poor spelling and or handwriting. And sometimes you'll even see students have trouble with even starting their sentences at the left-hand margin. Sometimes they'll start them in the middle of the page because sometimes that visual motor integration is also impaired. And then very, very frequently, you will see spelling skills that often lag behind reading. And you'll actually see that with most people who are learning to read, even if they don't have a disability. So let's talk about that piece for a minute, just because I get lots of questions about it. Or lots of, my child's reading has gotten really good, but they're still struggling with spelling. So why is spelling often harder? So let's just think ways to make the long E sound. So the sound E. And I don't know if anyone knows, but there are several ways to make the long E sound. There's one that's called open syllable E. So like the word he, that's an open syllable, meaning the vowel is not encumbered by another consonant. So that's one way I can make the long E sound. I can have two E's together, like the word feet. I could have EI, like ceiling. I could have E consonant E, or sometimes your students might call this magic E, which is E plus any consonant with an E at the end that is silent, and like in the word athlete. I could have EA, that also says E as in eagle. And I could have EY at the end of a word like monkey. So if you think about reading, I can see an EY in a word like monkey and know that it makes the long E sound. I can see the two E's in feet and know that it makes the long E sound, so I can read it. But if you just give me a word and I have no visual, I have to decipher which of these 6 ways am I supposed to spell that long E sound. So it can be really hard for students, and that is why spelling often lags behind. Now, there are rules, kind of like EY will only come at the end, but you have to be taught those rules, especially if you have dyslexia. You need to learn all of the rules. And there are some good books that can help support with that. But that is why spelling often lags behind. So let's talk about instructional support. So any struggling reader, including those with dyslexia, needs certain things instructionally in order to learn to read and be successful in the classroom. So we in Virginia have something called the Virginia Literacy Act, and this is a law that was passed that says every student in grades K through 8 is going to be screened for reading difficulties. Now, I will say here in Fairfax County, we have been screening for years. We were doing that before this law was enacted, but the law just holds everyone accountable for doing so. So if you've heard of the VALS screener, that's what we're using in grades K through 8. Every student in grades K through 5 will have evidence-based literacy instruction in the classroom. Now, the law says K through 5 because in most districts, 6th grade is actually in middle school, but here in FCPS, that does extend to 6th grade. Students identified as being at risk for reading difficulties on that screener are going to receive intervention. Gone are the days where in order to get intervention, you have to have an IEP. That is not the case. Intervention is for any student who needs it. And then reading specialists, and each school should have one at a minimum. Those reading specialists are going to oversee the development and monitoring of reading plans for students deemed high risk. So on these screeners in K3, students will be identified as high risk, moderate risk, or mild. I think it's mild or no risk, low risk, sorry. It's low, moderate, high. So students who are high risk on that screener will receive a reading plan. In grades 4 through 8, a student who did not pass their reading SOL will receive a reading plan. Also in grades 4 through 8, any student who had read aloud on their SOL but still passed will be given this screener, and then based on the screener results, may have a reading plan. So again, what that was saying, the second bullet, every student will receive evidence-based literacy instruction in the classroom. So that is where instructional support starts. It starts at what we call tier 1. And I have tier 1 in quotes just because sometimes these tiers can be confusing. And tier 1 just means in the classroom. Every student is a tier 1 student or receives tier 1 instruction. We don't tier the students, we tier the instruction. So that means it's starting school-wide, the bottom of the pyramid. Everyone is getting tier 1 instruction. Tier 2 is when they need some targeted intervention. And then tier 3 is where they need intensive intervention. And the tier 3 are likely going to be your students who require reading plans. But again, it all starts at tier 1, which will include classroom accommodations. So being able to have the texts read aloud. Perhaps you need, some writing accommodations, things like that, but you're still going to get that tier 1 instruction because it's really important that students get that. And the reason it's really important is because that's what the research tells us. So there's a great research study that showed that improving general education curriculum, so the instruction that our students are getting in their regular classroom, just improving that has the same impact as adding 25 to 50 additional days to the school year. So really solid classroom instruction is really important. And the same study showed that the students who received that more rigorous content made 1.7 months of additional gains than the students who did not. But was even more telling was that that impact was even stronger for the struggling students. So the lowest performing students gained 7.3 months of learning gains just by getting really solid, rigorous instruction in the classroom. So that is why it's really important for our students to get that instruction. Because in order to teach students to read, we really need to teach them content and develop their background knowledge and vocabulary. So it's not just about reading the words on the page. I have to understand what those words mean. And I'm going to get that in my Tier 1 instruction. So I need to be getting the same instruction. If I am a student who is struggling with reading, I need to get that same level of vocabulary, that same level of content knowledge that my peers are getting, even if I'm reading words at a lower level, because otherwise I'm never going to catch up. And the students with dyslexia especially need that Tier 1 instruction, because when they're decoding below grade level, if they're only experiencing texts that they can successfully read the words in, they're missing out on that content and that vocabulary that the rest of their peers are learning. And again, that's not going to close the gap for our students. And I have this reminder up here for the baseball study. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with it, but it was a fascinating study that was done a while ago. But what they did was they had 4 groups of students. So they had a group of students who knew a lot about baseball and were really strong readers. They had a second group of students who knew a lot about baseball, but were really struggling readers. They had a third group who knew nothing about baseball, but were really strong readers. And then there was a fourth group that struggled to read and decode and also knew nothing about baseball. And so they had all of the students read a passage and then answer questions. And what they found was the students who did the best, no surprise, the students who did the best were the ones who knew a lot about baseball and were excellent readers. But the students who did the next best were not the ones who were really solid decoders and knew nothing about baseball, but the students who knew a lot about baseball but were struggling readers. And that just emphasizes the point that we really need that strong Tier 1 instruction, because the more I know about a topic, the more likely I am to understand what I'm reading. So you could teach me comprehension strategies all you want, but if I have no background knowledge, I'm not going to be able to find the main idea of what I read. So that background knowledge and that vocabulary are really, really important. The 3 biggest areas that lead to reading comprehension, we go back to that simple view of reading, that word recognition, and that language comprehension. And in language comprehension is vocabulary and background knowledge. So that's the Tier 1 instruction, which is where everything starts. But students with dyslexia and struggling readers also need intervention. So what should that look like? So you have probably heard the term OG, and it gets tossed around a lot, but I don't know that everyone actually understands what is OG. OG is actually people. It is Dr. Samuel Orton and Anna Gillingham. They are the O and the G in OG. So Dr. Orton was a neuropsychiatrist, and he began studying children with language disabilities way back in 1920. He had a hypothesis that struggling readers had a failed dominance in that left hemisphere of the brain. So if you think back to that picture that we looked at all those slides ago of the dyslexic brain and the non-dyslexic brain, he was right, right? There was left hemisphere, parts of the left hemisphere that were not engaged in the reading process. So because of that hypothesis, he developed what we now know as multisensory teaching. And what that means is you are engaging my auditory senses, my visual senses, and my kinesthetic movement senses. So perhaps you are showing me a letter while I'm hearing the sound, or you are showing me a letter and I'm writing something. But mixing those senses, because what happens is if the language part of my brain isn't engaged, then I have to engage some of the parts on the right side, which is the more creative, which is why I need audio, visual, kinesthetic. So that was his hypothesis. And he then teamed up with Anna Gillingham, who was an educator and a psychologist. And together, they worked out this Orton Gillingham methodology. So, what's really important to remember is it's a methodology, it's not a program. There are many programs that use this methodology in their instruction, but there is not like an Orton Gillingham program. They are Orton Gillingham based. They use the Orton Gillingham methodology, but again, there's not like one OG program. But this methodology is what is really important for our students with dyslexia. So, intervention. So, what are we teaching in that intervention? We are teaching the rules of reading and spelling. So, there's varying numbers on how many, what percentage of English words are truly irregular. I've seen 4%, I've seen 10%. Regardless, most of the words in English are decodable if you know the rules. So we know we have 26 letters in our alphabet, and those 26 letters can make 44 different sounds. And then when I take letter combinations, I have like 250 different ways to make sounds in the English language. But when I learn all of those, students or anyone can decode most English words. So that's what we need to teach. We need to teach those rules of reading and spelling. But how do we teach them? We know our students with dyslexia need it to be in a logical order. It makes no sense for me to teach you more complex English rules or rules of reading and spelling if I haven't started with the simple ones. So it needs to be in a logical order. It needs to be really explicit. Sometimes when we're teaching math, we let kids kind of explore and discover on their own. We can't do that when we're learning to read. It needs to be explicit for our struggling readers. It needs to be cumulative. So I need to start simple and I need to build on those skills and keep going as I teach those rules. And again, it needs to be multisensory. So you're looking at something and hearing something. You're hearing something and writing something. I need to engage all of those senses because I really need to rewire a dyslexic brain so that the parts on the right hemisphere are engaged in that process. And then intervention should always be diagnostic. We're not just blowing through the curriculum, we are constantly assessing and taking data to ensure students are mastering concepts. And when they're not, we need to adjust our instruction. Do we need to reteach? Do we need to bring in more multisensory techniques? That's the diagnostic part of intervention. So let's talk about some myths and some facts about dyslexia. And this all comes from a book by Jan Hasbrook, who is a premier educator, in her book, Conquering Dyslexia. So a sign of dyslexia is writing letters backwards or upside down. And you could just give thumbs up, thumbs down, if you think this is true or false. Okay, it's actually false. Students aren't writing letters backwards or upside down. This goes back to that phonological piece and something that we call orthographic mapping. So if I hear the sound, my brain knows that that is a P. A dyslexic brain may hear the sound and not be sure which letter to associate that sound with. So I'm not writing my P backwards. My brain is just not entirely sure, is it the P or the Q that makes that sound? So it's really not about writing letters backwards or upside down. To them, a P looks like a P, a Q looks like a Q, but when they're hearing the sounds, their brain just has trouble figuring out which one are they supposed to use. How about if a student has dyslexia, they have to have an IEP? True or false? It's also false. It's not the IEP that they need, it's the intervention. And you don't need an IEP to get that intervention. So that's really what we need to be making sure that these students are receiving, again, is intervention. There are certainly some students whose dyslexia may be severe enough, or they may have some other um, comorbid conditions that require an IEP, but just having dyslexia doesn't automatically mean special education. How about reading may require more effort and academic support, but students with dyslexia can learn to read. I see a gigantic thumbs up. Yes, they can. They absolutely can. Again, they just need that multisensory instruction and that intervention. There are very few people in the world who can just naturally learn how to read. Um, Most people need instruction, explicit instruction, again, on those rules of reading and spelling. How about dyslexia is caused by problems with vision, meaning the eyes don't track correctly or they see words and letters backwards. Is that true or false? Actually false. So dyslexia is language based. Now, vision, a child with a vision issue, that can certainly impact their reading 100%. However, if working on the vision issue then addresses and corrects the reading difficulties, then it wasn't dyslexia, it was a vision problem. So dyslexia is not caused by problems with vision. A student with dyslexia, or the dyslexia does not cause students to read or see words backwards or letters backwards. They're seeing them the way the rest of us do. Again, it's that when their brain sees it, they're not sure what sounds to associate with those letters. How about many people with dyslexia have average or above average IQs? Is that true or false? I love the big thumbs up. I don't know how you make it bigger, but I love it. Yes, true. In most cases, not all, but most cases, someone with dyslexia has an average to above average IQ because that difficulty with learning to read is typically unexpected. Now, it can run in families, so maybe if your parents are dyslexic, it's not totally unexpected that a child would also be, but it is unexpected relative to their other cognitive abilities. How about dyslexia cannot be identified before grade 3? True or false? Nope, that is false. We can identify it. We can identify those markers that we talked about earlier. There are signs of dyslexia before grade 3. And that is really why the screener is so important, that we're screening kids in kindergarten, first grade, so that when we start to see those signs of dyslexia, we can intervene quickly and early, and then we can actually decrease the number of students who are getting IEPs in third grade. Because again, not everyone with a reading difficulty has dyslexia. So if we can catch those kids early and do that remediation early and rewire their brains early, then we can actually prevent a lot of them from ending up with diagnoses and in special ed. How about ADHD as a part of dyslexia? True or false? That's another one that's false. Students with dyslexia, and I've seen some research say up to 50% of students with dyslexia also have ADHD, but they're actually two separate things. You can be dyslexic and just have dyslexia. You can have ADHD and just have ADHD. Sometimes you may have both, but they do not always co-occur. And last one of these, there is a silver bullet to remediate dyslexia and all children will outgrow it. True or false? So that's also false. you're not ever going to really outgrow dyslexia. One of the most exciting outcomes of dyslexia research is the firm conclusion that with that early identification and appropriate instruction, it is possible to overcome and remediate it, but their brain is always going to work a little bit differently. Some may always read more slowly. Their dyslexia may impact how quickly they can decode words. So that may always be a struggle. So no one's going to actually outgrow it. But again, we can remediate, we can rewire that brain if we're catching them early and intervening early. So let's talk about some resources and supports. So how about how to help your child at home? First thing I would say is remember that your child has a lot of strengths and to remember those and celebrate those and ensure that your child is getting lots of opportunity to pursue those. Keep your expectations high. Students need to learn to overcome difficulties. They don't need to, like, preventing them from experiencing them is not helpful. Productive struggle actually enhances learning, and there's research to support that as well. If everything is easy for me, I'm not going to learn. I need to struggle, I need to overcome, I need to persevere. So keep your expectations high. Be patient. Your child's going to have off days. I have a few times done a dyslexia simulation where I have had people read a passage that is not decodable, and then try and answer questions about it, try and write some sentences. It's literally a 10 to 15-minute activity, and it is amazing the number of adults who just quit the task or who are completely exhausted after that 10 to 15 minutes. And remember, your child is going to go through that all day. So when they come home, they're tired. So be patient. They're going to have off days. Some days are going to be harder than others. The other big thing I would say is to help them see the joy in books. And that doesn't mean forcing them to read. It could be audiobooks. Let them listen to the stories. What that does is it helps them hear what fluent reading sounds like, and it exposes them to that higher level vocabulary. Graphic novels. Again, I will say reluctant reader and slow to pick up the concept of reading. The one thing that he would pick up were graphic novels. I let him do it. Was it my first choice? No. But I also discovered there are a lot of classic stories that come in graphic novel form. Moby Dick is in graphic novel form. Treasure Island. Um, there's some great books out there. And if that's because you just want to foster a love of opening a book, of hearing a book, of being exposed to that content is really what we want. Other ways you can do that is to read aloud with or to your child. Reading to your child some of those higher level books that they can't necessarily read on their own is a fabulous way to, again, model fluent reading, to have discussions about what's happening in the book, talk about that vocabulary. Again, you can expose them to vocabulary that's like above grade level if you're reading with or to them. And the reason that's really important is because the chances of a child decoding a difficult word are greater if that word is in their oral vocabulary, meaning they have heard that word before, been exposed to that word before, and therefore know what it means. I can teach you every rule of English, and you may decode a 6-syllable word perfectly, but if you've never heard it before and don't know what it means, you're not going to associate meaning with it. So reading to your child, especially after a long day of school, is perfectly fine. And actually what I most often recommend. I don't tend to recommend having kids independently read or read to you at home, especially after a long day of school, unless it is something that they've already read that day or previously in school. So sometimes your student may come home with a practice story that they read in their intervention. Reading that to you, fabulous. Let them do that. But trying to find a grade level book for your child to read out loud isn't necessarily, actually, it's not likely to improve their reading ability. So again, foster a love of books and read with or to your child. Other things that you can do at home, you can do some phonological awareness activities. You can do these in the car. You can do them while you're making dinner. Again, it's building that association of sounds. Everything that we say is made up of sounds. So you can do something like phoneme isolation, blending, and segmenting. So an example of that would be saying the word cat and ask your child, what sound do you hear at the beginning of cat? And they'll say k. That's isolating the phoneme. You sticking with the word cat, have them blend it, say the sounds k, at. Have them blend it together and make the word cat. Have them segment the sounds, separate the sounds. So you would say, tell me the sounds in the word cat. They could count them. Maybe you just ask them, how many sounds do you hear? And they would count 3. What are the sounds that you hear? K, at. So that's the lowest or most simplest level of phoneme awareness, of phonological awareness, and blending and segmenting are the 2 most important skills for reading and spelling, respectively. In order to read a word, I have to take the sounds and blend them together to make a word. In order to spell a word, I have to hear the word and be able to isolate, separate those sounds, segment those sounds. So those are 2 of the most important skills. You could do adding, deleting, or substituting. So to add, I could do, I could say the word cat. I would say add s to the end of cat, and they would say cats. I could delete a sound. I could say the word cats. Now, or I'll do cat, that's easier. I would say the word cat. Now say cat, but don't say k. So they're going to delete that k and just say at. I could have them substitute. So I could say the word cat. Now say the word cat, but instead of k, say b, and they'll say bat. That's substituting. You could do something like just how many sounds do you hear in the word cat? If I said a 2-syllable word, how many syllables do you hear in the word backpack? How many words are in a sentence? If I say, I left my backpack at school, how many words do you hear in that sentence? Those are some other activities that you can do. They're all oral. There's nothing in front of your child. And again, they're quick, just little things that you can do at home. There are some other things like word practice activities. You could do word chains or mapping letters to sounds. A word chain, I don't have, do I have a sample of a word chain? I don't have a sample of a word chain. Whoops. Oh, goodness, sorry. So a word chain would be like if I had the word cat and then you change it to cats and then change cats to bats, where you're changing just one letter. Just one letter. Don't change more than one letter. Change more than one letter in a word. You could use letter tiles for this. You could do it on paper, but that's kind of a fun activity. Something else you can do is mapping letters to sounds, which is kind of what this has up here. So you'd say a word, give them, we call these Alconin boxes, make little boxes, use use magnets, use chips, and have them count the sounds in words and map the letters to the sounds. A big word of caution about these last 2 activities, though, is don't use words that have patterns that your student hasn't yet learned. So if my student hasn't yet learned that OW can say ow, I don't want to use the word clown. So just a word of caution on that part. But again, these phonological awareness activities, they're quick, easy, they're fun. There are resources or books if you wanted a book to do some activities. There's some good ones out there for that as well. Other resources, there is a dyslexia handbook on the Fairfax County Public School website. It's been recently updated, I'm happy to report. So instead of clicking and ending up on 12 different pages, it's now 1, but it has all of the same information on it. One area I'd like to direct everyone to, though, is assistive technology services. There are a lot of great technological supports for students, and a lot of them are available to all students. You don't have to have an IEP, don't have to have a learning disability. There are a lot of great add-ons that students can use, and they may already have many of them on their school laptops. So assistive technology services, which you can get to, whoops, oh goodness. On the left-hand side, it's under special education, services and programs, and then assistive technology. And there's all of these things under assistive technology. But what I'm really going to kind of point you to are these inclusive and assistive technology tools. So there are a couple that I'm just going to point out. Again, you have access to all of this information on the website. But one is tools to support all learners. So again, these are tools that are available to any student. And then there's specific tools just for students with reading difficulties. I'll also mention there are some for if your student has trouble with executive functioning, which is mostly related to organization, completing tasks. There are supports there as well. But we're kind of just looking at the all learners and then students with reading difficulties. So supports for all learners. There are keyboarding resources. I will say too, as students get older, teaching them how to type is really important. They're going to do more and more of their assignments on the computer. There's resources for organization. There's some for reading, writing. If your student also struggles with math, which can happen, there's resources for math, there's captioning, and then there's also additional support. So tools to support students with reading difficulties. One good one is text-to-speech readers, because again, we don't want to limit our students from that high-level vocabulary and that grade-level content just because they have trouble decoding the words. So that's where text-to-speech is really helpful. There are screen readers that will read assignments. A lot of the programs that we have in school now come with that feature. So I know if you have an elementary school student in Benchmark, there is a tool that will read the content to the students. There are also, you might want your student, if for writing assignments, to go the other way, so speech to text. So again, when we talked about earlier that sometimes our students with dyslexia have a fabulous oral vocabulary and they would write a ton if writing weren't so difficult. So sometimes just letting them speak into the computer and then having the computer type it, they're going to have to learn how to edit still, but that can be a fabulous tool as well, and that's available. Actually, that comes with Google. If you need other supports, so within Fairfax County Public School, on the general education side, every school has at least one reading specialist on staff. The reading specialists are much more well-versed in dyslexia than they used to be, and they all know where to find me. I am the dyslexia specialist at the district level. I support every single school, all schools, K-12, all students. But when there are cases where they're just not sure what to do or a student's not making the progress they're expecting on an intervention, they can call me in at any time to come and observe and help support them. On the special education side, if you have a student who is going through the eligibility process, psychological services is a great resource. And they have for each region one psychologist who is their dyslexia advisor. So schools can reach out to that person if they're having trouble interpreting any of the data that's being used to determine if a student qualifies for special education. That's through the eligibility process. Once a student has an IEP, there is the Office of Special Education Instruction. And again, I used to be on that team. They have resource teachers that will go out and support schools, support teachers, observe lessons, model lessons. They have typically there's 2 resource teachers per region. They'll split the region, and then there's 1 education specialist over each region, but they're a fabulous resource. Within your school, if your child already has an IEP, the school psychologist who helps with identification and evaluation can also often just help after the student already has an IEP, help look at those psychological report results and help translate how some of that's going to impact a student in the classroom. And then you always have the special education team at the school. Other resources, and these are linked on this slide. These are just some that I prefer. So the Virginia Department of Education has their own dyslexia FAQ. The National Center on Improving Literacy has a lot of great information, as does the International Dyslexia Association. Those are two really great organizations to support you and your child. One other one that you may be less familiar with is the Yale Center for Dyslexia and Creativity. Um, they have a parent section. They do a lot of amazing research. It's one of my favorite resources I think that exist is Yale. And they do some really great studies. One of my favorite studies, they did an impact study where they looked at students with dyslexia and how they did like post high school. It was pretty amazing work. And if you ever hear about the book Overcoming Dyslexia, which you've probably heard of by Sally Shaywitz, this is where she comes from. She works with the Yale Center for Dyslexia and Creativity. So I'm going to give everyone, that was a lot of information. And before we get into the Q&A, I just want to give everyone a moment for just a little pause, a little reflection. Think about a word that captured your attention or a phrase that you related to or moved you, or a sentence that was meaningful. Or you could even reflect on things that you came into this webinar thinking, and now you have a different perspective. And we'll just take a couple minutes to do that. Okay, so I think timing wise, we did pretty well. And we have about a half an hour left for questions and answers, which I will have Nadia help me facilitate.